Thrilled to have you back once again for an episode on the More People podcast. I'm your host today, Andrew Fitzmaurice from More People. My guest today, Mike Matthews of Roythornes. Hi, Mike.
Andy.
So you're man and boy pretty much at Roythornes, aren't you? Talk to us about your role. What do you actually do? You're a partner, we know that much, but what do you actually do?
So I always start off by saying I'm older than I look, which at some point I'll stop being able to say, but I've been there 15 years this year. I'm a partner in the M&A team, which means I lead buying and selling of businesses. I'm also the head of the food team quite recently, and I'm also on the board of directors, which is another aspect of my role.
The food bit, I guess, is where we should talk most, given what we do and our specialisms. But stitching that together with the M&A side of things, what is the world looking like? What is going on at the moment in terms of appetite and consolidation and M&A work?
The data goes something like this. Year on year, the last few years, it's got busier and busier M&A activity to the point that they think that there's going to be a drop-off soon. There was a big pause after the budget in October because there was such a rush leading up to the budget. After the budget, because everyone was terrified of what had happened to capital gains tax, and particularly when you did owner managed businesses, which we generally are, people paused for thought. So then there was a couple of months, particularly in November and December, where very little happened, certainly in the legal front, where bearing in mind we are the end of the process normally rather than selling it. But now it's getting busier again.
So what percentage, if you had to guesstimate, what percentage of those deals would have happened anyway and have just been rushed in terms of timescales, or have actually been pulled significantly forwards that mightn't have happened were it not for some of the changes?
I think in October we did, or leading up to October, we probably did 20 completions. I'm making that number up, but it's that sort of number. It was that sort of thing, a lot. There's probably half of those that were certainly commercially leveraged to be, if this doesn't happen by end of October, we're not doing it, because the changes, or the fear of the changes were such. We would therefore see some bad behaviours from the result of that, because people naturally rush stuff through, like STL turning out. You just naturally go on to get the deal done because it's such a hard deadline. So we saw plenty of that. We then saw a couple also that slipped over because they just couldn't be done on those timescales. Sometimes naturally you run out of time. I think all of those actually have since been completed because they realised the changes weren't that material. The whole fear of going from 10% to 45% for BADR initially didn't happen, which is good news.
Has it calmed down now, do you think? The nature of where things have changed as far as business assets disposal relief and capital gains tax, is it calming down to the point where your world is a bit more normal?
I think it's calmed down. I mean, as you say, who knows really? In terms of the business side of things, it wasn't disastrous. Losing effectively the benefit that was business asset disposal relief BADR for the first £1 million, ultimately trying to align it to CGT isn't the end of the world. I say that as a lawyer rather than someone selling a business. But if you roll back a few years to when the entrepreneur's relief, as it was then, threshold went from 10 million to 1 million, actually that was probably a more serious financial change. Because people lost £9 million of relief, that was bad news. So I think what was going on, or what is going on to the first £1 million relief, in the grand scheme of many deals we deal with, when we're talking about 10, 20, 30 million pound deals, is a bit moot. But equally, if you're selling a business for a few $100,000, it makes a big difference.
So if we park and get away from some of the reductions in those allowances and the doom and gloom side of things and go back to what your role actually is in terms of the service you provide, irrespective of what the percentage savings might be for a seller, what does a lawyer actually do when it comes to working the M&A part of the process?
So we tend to not get involved right at the beginning. So clients more often than not come to us when a deal is in the making. Either people have been approached randomly, which happens more often than you might think, when someone receives a letter and they actually bite, and all of a sudden they come to us and say, we've been offered X for our company, can you help? Or they may come to us when we know a client for a long time and saying, we're thinking about selling the company, who do you recommend to actually broker the deal? They're normally the corporate finance advisors or the accountants. And then depending how early we get involved, we then have those discussions and then review heads of terms, and there on in deal with the process. I suspect it's probably 9 times out of 10, it's the former option or former process where we get approached saying we have a buyer, or we're going to sell. The process there on in is, and it depends what sort of sale you're doing or purchase you're doing. Let's assume we're selling on the sale side here just for this conversation. And most of our work is or maybe 3/4 of our work is sell side, largely because of where we're based. This sort of region tends to act for sellers selling out to big buyers. The big buyers generally have London or city lawyers acting for them. That's generally a theme. So family-owned business, let's say, selling for £10 million, let's say, what would we do? We would look at the terms as that happens. So negotiate those. There's some silly things that often get put in there, exclusivity periods, confidentiality, and those sort of things. We just make sure we get ironed out early on. Then we help with legal due diligence, which is when the buyer grills you on your business, and that is from absolutely everything. That is from your registers of members, which are your basic books of your company, all the way through to your contracts, your tax, your disputes, your property, all that sort of stuff. The long questionnaire, we help the clients go through those, answer the questions properly, and make sure we assist with any issues that arise. We try to remedy them, or we have a conversation with the client / advisor early on to say, by the way, there's a big issue here. How are we going to deal with this? Because it needs dealing head on early doors, ideally. Then there's the main documentation, which is called the share purchase agreement, if it's a share sale, or an asset purchase agreement, if it's a business sale. And we negotiate that, which the buyer's lawyer prepares.
I imagine if it's a bit like recruitment, it's easier for me to regale the tales, as crazy as they are, than it is to make up new ones, to be honest, because you see everything eventually. What are some of the more unusual, wackiest, most surprising things you've found in that due diligence process?
For the family-owned businesses, particularly the smaller ones, well, of all sizes, but particular ones, are some wacky things going through the books, or some wacky assets coming out of the company before completion. Some very valuable items that get moved around at the 11th hour, often at no cost, which itself is a problem. We've had people who own castles that are run more or less through the company, and there's all sorts of stories about that particular one. But yeah, we see all sorts.
Is it your role and responsibility to smooth these things out, therefore, in that process?
We need to deal with it head on. And so it's often about finding the issue, trying to work out the solution, and then presenting it to the other side, saying, this has happened, we're sorting it. Or we have to say, this has happened, how do you think we need to sort it with your blessing? So we certainly, from a sales side, it's very common for a seller to try to sort things out, not want to tell us too much about it, not because they're trying to be naughty, just because they think we'll sort it. And their idea of sorting it often isn't the right one either. So there's a bit of that going on. So it's just, I guess, developing a relationship with your advisors early on that you can go, crikey, this has happened. Just realise I shouldn't have been running my wife's car through the company for the last 10 years, or I've bought this painting at home through the company, whoops. How do I do it? Rather than going, so right, we'll just delete that line there, which is obviously a disaster.
And we've touched upon this conversation before, whether at dinners or on a golf course generally, about attracting new people into the market. And anecdotally, it always feels like you don't have a massive struggle bringing in that next cohort of graduates at the bottom rung into Roythornes. You're a Spalding guy, away from university, back to Spalding, straight into Roythornes, and you've climbed the ladder there. What general advice do you give to either graduates coming into the market or advice to companies about how you can be successful with attracting that next generation?
We're not unique in the troubles we're facing post-COVID in terms of office attendance and that whole debate about can people office. And we are now in a position where we basically say 3 days a week in the office. That's kind of the direction of travel, which seems to be more or less market. You know better than I do, but that seems to be sort of market. For a period of time, the more junior members of staff who weren't in the office amongst their friends, that I think was a real issue for retention. I think generally we are lucky that we have a fairly down-to-earth group of people in the business all the way through the runs of the hierarchy. No one thinks Spalding is glamorous, because it's not. And I say that's someone who grew up there, my family are there, but it's not the bright lights. But generally people get that. They're there, we pay market rates, we have a nice culture, we have nice benefits, we don't flog people to death, and we like to think people grow up with us and want to be there. We naturally, therefore, my point around the office attendance, that was an interesting point. I'm sure it's not just affected us, affected everyone, in that when people aren't in the office and people are sat working from home, why not go work in London and get paid twice the amount and sat in the exact same desk? Okay, you may work a couple of hours longer, but it's quite glamorous to have a city firm in your CV. I get it. We've all been young and ambitious. We try to pride ourselves on trying to do good work with nice people, and people tend to stay with us for a long time. We don't want to be saying you have to come in 5 days a week. That's just not the market. That's not going to wear anyone. But equally, our hearts say it's really cool to be in 5 days a week. Actually, you really benefit from it. But it's that messaging of people believing it, people choosing to respond to that. We're not going to force that, but you kind of hope people realise that's for their gain long term.
How much time do you spend with clients as opposed to behind a computer screen doing the paperwork?
More and more, I suppose. Although many times, much of the spending with clients is coming on Teams call behind a computer screen, but probably a quarter of my time, maybe not quite that, maybe less than that, but a chunk of my time, and that's part and parcel of the role of the more senior you get, the wider your team is, the more that I'm often on call or in meetings with others who are sort of running things more, but I'm kind of involved at a more senior level. So because of that, I tend to get involved in quite a few things at all levels.
The rise of AI and how certain things can be automated might make some of the more mundane done more quickly, which frees up time for the part that AI, in my opinion, is never going to replace, which is the nature of trusted person-to-person contact and having that confidence in dealing with the customer. That's the same for your world.
Yeah, AI is. I mean, it's obviously the topic of much conversations, isn't it? We're not seeing a huge amount in our world yet. The sort of back end AI, which is what our technical director tells us, that actually we are using AI in way more ways than we even notice, because it's kind of happening in the back end of our systems or some of our dictation systems, all that sort of stuff. There's clearly going to be an area of some of the more routine aspects where AI just can definitely use it. I mean, we're using it, or I'm using it at base level, things like Copilot and so on, which I think it seems to be the entry level offering in businesses, and I'm playing around with that, as several of us are also. But like all these things, we need to be involved in that and make sure we're making use of it, otherwise we'll be left behind.
Yeah, indeed. Final point, this is our 25th year. Lots of 25-year celebrations going on at MorePeople this year, hopefully. Where do you think you and or Roythornes will be in 25 years' time?
Well, we are taking really big steps to ensure we are not snaffled up or tempted to be snaffled up by the consolidators in the industry. It's very easy and very tempting to sell out, not just law firms, anyone who's being offered 3, 4, 5 times multiple. Everyone's human. The powers that be, before my involvement in anything of this level, it has been to make sure the senior of the juniors are in a position where we are really embedded, and there's no temptation or wish for us to be involved in that. So I would hope 25 years time would be bigger, better, but just as we are now.
Well, it'll be fun to watch. Thanks for your time, Mike.
Thank you.